Hello friends, welcome to this lecture of soil science and technology. Today we will be discussing about different pathways of weathering as well as different factors of soil formation. Now in the last couple of lectures we talked about what is weathering and what are different types of weathering. So you know that weathering is basically the disintegration and decomposition of rocks and minerals, and weathering can be differentiated into three major types. One is physical weathering, another is chemical weathering, another is biological weathering. Now physical weathering, the another name of physical weathering is disintegration, and it is basically the in case of physical weathering the rock size gets smaller and there is no chemical alteration in case of physical weathering. So another name of physical weathering is mechanical weathering. However, in case of chemical weathering there will be a complete change of chemical characteristics or chemical composition. That is why the other name of chemical weathering is decomposition. And the third kind of weathering is called the biological weathering, and biological weathering is basically the combination of disintegration and decomposition. So it is basically composed of both physical weathering and chemical weathering. So we have discussed about different factors of physical weathering, what are the different factors or different processes of chemical weathering, and also biological weathering. So today we will be discussing about different pathways of weathering and how the rocks and minerals weathered in different pathways to form ultimately soils. So in this slide you can see that we have presented the different pathways of weathering. So obviously the starting point of weathering is rock, as you already know. So there are three types of rocks: igneous, sedimentary, metamorphic. So in this pathway you will see that chemical breakdown or decomposition, or in other way it is chemical weathering. And here we have listed the different processes of chemical weathering like solutions, hydrolysis, organic acid solutions, and then decomposition, oxidation and hydration. And these are the final outcome of this chemical weathering, or final molecules or cations or anions of chemical weathering. So in case of solution, as you can see, there are different types of soluble materials like different cations: calcium, magnesium, potassium, sodium, iron and sulphate. In case of hydrolysis, obviously the end product is silicic acid. In case of organic acid solutions, different types of organic complexes of Al3 plus and Fe3 plus. And in case of decomposition, oxidation and hydration, obviously there will be hydrous oxides of Fe and L. And this pathway shows the disintegration into minerals or physical breakdown, or in other words it is physical weathering. Now physical weathering also, depending on the clay mineral internal structure or crystal structure, or depending on the crystal structure of minerals, the mineral weather at different pace. For example, there are some minerals which weather very slowly, there are some minerals which weather slowly, and there are some minerals which weather very easily. For example, in case of quartz and muscovite, they weather very slowly because they are resistant to weathering, and feldspars and biotite are slowly weatherable minerals, and calcite, augite, hornblende, all these are very easily weatherable minerals, as we have already discussed in the Bowen's series and Goldich series in the previous lecture. And all these weathered minerals will further undergo chemical decomposition to form other silicate clays or clay minerals. So this is in a nutshell the pathways of weathering. Obviously these weathering processes occur simultaneously and ultimately results in different cations and different oxides of iron, aluminum, or different silicate clays. So this is basically in nutshell about different pathways of weathering. So, if we see weathering at a glance, this slide shows weathering at a glance. Now, you see that the parent material, and parent material is acted upon by different types of physical forces like frost, wind, rain, hail and ice, and obviously heat and cold. So, there are different types of physical factors which are acting over these parent materials, and these parent materials will undergo mechanical weathering to produce these fine parent materials, as you can see, and these fine parent materials will further undergo chemical weathering in the while reacting with different types of acids and moisture present in the environment or in the soil, and ultimately they will form different types of mineral nutrients which will comes into the soil solution, and in the forms of different cations and anions, and also they will form silica, silt, sand and quartz. And this silica will further undergo different types of chemical reactions with oxides of iron, alumina to form 3-layer clay or 2-layer clay. We will discuss these details in details later on while we will be discussing about the clay mineral structure. But remember that this chemical weathering is one of the major factor for production of different types of clay minerals. And remember that this physical weathering prepares the ground for chemical weathering, or in other words, as a result of physical weathering, the total surface area increases for more reaction, and this more reaction will undergo these more chemical reactions will ultimately produce these clay minerals. So we have covered the soil weathering and how different weathering process occurs: physical weathering, chemical weathering and biological weathering. Let us see what is soil formation. If you remember, the soil formation is basically composed of two major steps. One is weathering, another is pedogenesis. Now, pedogenesis or soil formation is brought about by 4 major processes. We call them pedogenic processes. These 4 processes are addition, losses, transformations and translocations. Now, as you can see here, this is a 3-dimensional three-dimensional representation of a soil, where you can see all these 4 pedogenic processes: addition, losses, transformation and translocation. We will discuss them in details one by one. So, what are additions? Addition is basically input of mineral or input of materials to the developing soil profile from outside sources. When we are adding some materials or compounds from outside sources into the soil, that is called addition. For example, in case of rain, that adds water into the soil, dust adds mineral into the soil, animals and nutrients adds organic matter into the soil, and human adds fertilizer into the soil, and evaporation of groundwater adds salts to the soil. So, all these are adding something into the soil, and that is one of the major pedogenic process. What are the losses? Well, evaporation carries away water, as you know. This is one form of loss from soil. Another is erosion, which carries away soil particles. Organic matter decomposition is another type of loss, where we are losing the organic matter and it is converting into carbon dioxide and other forms of organic matter, and nutrients and mineral leach from the soil, and that is another type of loss. So, all these losses are also important pedogenic processes which help in for proper soil formation. Now, what is transformation? Transformation is basically process of modification and destruction of existing soil components. And remember that it always results in synthesis of new products. For example, weathering synthesizes secondary minerals from primary minerals, and also weathering alters the size of the minerals, especially the physical weathering, and also dead leaves transform to humus. So, all these are important transformation processes which are responsible for soil formation. And finally, translocation. So, translocation is basically horizontal or vertical movement of materials. For example, in case of water, the translocation of water from by gravity or capillary forces in the soil, this is one form of translocation. And evaporation of in evaporation, when evaporation translocates soils to surface, that is another type of translocation. And when organisms carry materials from one place to another inside the soil, that is another form of translocation. So, all these are important forms of translocations which are responsible for soil formation. Now, let us see what are the important factors of soil formation. Now, Jenny in 1941 gave one equation which we call the soil forming factors, equation for soil forming factors. Now, obviously, this soil forming equation is very much important for a proper understanding of how soil forms. So, as you can see, we call it a CLORPT equation. Now, this equation was again given by the scientist Jenny in 1941, and this equation shows that soil property of a given soil is a function of 5 different factors. So, 5 different factors, first of all is climate, second is O, that is organisms, R stands for relief, P stands for parent material, and T stands for time. So, this is the first important soil forming equation given by any scientist, and obviously there are some further modification which have been proposed nowadays. I will discuss that later on. We will be discussing the digital soil mapping. So, again the soil, any soil property is basically a function of climate, organism, relief, parent material and time. So, we will discuss them one by one. So, the soil we see is a basically function of all these 5 factors: climate, organism, relief, parent material, time, and all these factors act simultaneously or interconnectingly to form soil, and this is a very slow forming process, and remember that for forming 1 inch of topsoil it requires almost million years. So, let us see their influence one by one. Obviously, the factors themselves act interdependently on soil, we will see that later on. And sometimes, however, one particular factor predominates and other being constants. So, when the dominant factor is climate, we call it climosequence, the soil type is known as climosequence. When the dominant factor is organism, we call it biosequence. When the dominant factor is relief, we call it toposequence. When the dominant factor is parent material, we call it lithosequence, and when the dominant factor is time, we call it chronosequence. I have given one example here of toposequence. So, toposequence basically says the adjacent soils that show different profile characteristics reflecting the influence of local topography are called toposequence. Again, soils that show different profile characteristics reflecting the influence of soil local topography are called toposequence. As you can see in this diagram, the soil, there are different types of soil which are formed in these places, and obviously there is difference in the steepness of the slope, and this is the parent material from which soil basically forms, and A horizon is basically a mineral mixed organic horizon which is present in almost all the soils, and parent materials with gravels and cobbles are shown by this dotted zone. So, as you can see, the soil profile or the thickness of the soil varies from one place to another place based on their position on the slope. For example, this soil which is present at the plains or concave part of the slope is showing higher thickness of the soil or a horizon, which is basically the soil horizon. However, the soil which forms here is showing somewhat smaller thickness. So, basically the thickness of the soil or soil characteristics is differing from one place to another place based on the local topography. So, that is why we can see the relief factor is more predominant here, and that is why we call it topo sequence. So, climate is very much important, because from the point of view of both precipitation as well as temperature, we will discuss them later on, but precipitation is the most influential factors which affects weathering, and effective precipitation and temperature are two major climatic factors. As you can see here, when there is an excess rainfall, obviously that will lead to excess leaching, and this excess leaching will ultimately form well weathered soil. Now, leaching is basically the downward movement of salt in solution form. So, obviously when there is an excess leaching, there will be well weathering or chemical weathering. Now, when there is a low rainfall, obviously there will be excess evaporation. When there will be excess evaporation, well, there will be salt deposition at the surface. So, these are showing basically the impact of climate for soil formation. As you can see, due to the climatic variation, there are two different types of soil being formed. One is highly leached podzol, which occurs due to high amount of leaching due to high rainfall, and another is salt affected arid soil, where salts are being deposited at the surface due to high evaporation and crusting of the soil. So, these are basically showing the effect of climate for soil formation. Now, another here in this slide you can see the impact of seasonal rainfall distribution, site topography, evaporative demand and soil permeability for soil development. Now, as you know that keeping other factors constant, increasing precipitation increases clay organic matter content and acidity. So, let us think that in this case, for example, let us consider the seasonal rainfall distribution. Let us consider there is a 600 millimeter of rainfall, and which is well distributed throughout the 12-month period, and obviously when there will be in another condition, those 600 millimeter of rainfall will be distributed throughout 6 months period. So, obviously in the second condition there will be more chance of leaching, and more leaching will further accelerates the chemical weathering. So, you can see seasonal rainfall distribution is an important part for soil chemical weathering or soil formation. Second is site topography. As you can see here, obviously the infiltration of water or effective rainfall is much higher in the relatively flat surfaces than that of the soil which is present in the steep slope. So, obviously the soil development also differ in these places due to difference in the site topography. When there will be high evaporative demand, and another case there will be low evaporative demand. In case of low evaporative demand, water infiltration will be more, and as a result there will be more soil development. And obviously, depending on the difference in soil permeability also, water movement also varies from one soil to another soil. For example, in case of sandy soil, there will be high leaching as compared to the clay soil, and obviously as a result of that, in case of sandy soil, the rate of soil formation is more as compared to clay soil. So, this slide basically shows the impact of different climatic factors for soil formation. So, what is regolith? We'll discuss this term later on more frequently. So, let us discuss what is regolith. So, regolith is a region of loose unconsolidated rock and dust that sits atop a layer of bedrock. So, at the bottom you will see the bedrock. If you dig down the soil vertically, and ultimately you will see at the bottom there are bedrocks from which soil forms, and above the bedrock they will see some unconsolidated rocks and dust, and we call them regolith. And this regolith contains both mineral matter, organic matter and all these things. So, and also let us see what is the impact of climate and precipitation and temperature. So, this slide shows the joint impact of precipitation and temperature. Now, as you can see in the Arctic region here, in the Arctic region, in both humid condition and arid climate region, there are two different, we are considering two different climates, one is arid climate, another is humid climate. So, in Arctic region, in both climatic situation, the soil formation, the rate of soil formation will be almost same. However, as we move from Arctic region to equator region, the rate of soil formation in humid climates, or in other words the rate of weathering in humid climates will be more, as compared to that of the Arctic or arid climate. So, this slide basically shows the joint impact of rainfall as well as temperature for soil formation. Okay. Another important factor for soil formation is organisms. Remember that microbes enhances biochemical weathering, and vegetative cover reduces erosions. Sometimes dead leaves accumulates aluminum and iron, and vegetation influences the soil type and vice versa. So, let us focus on the last point, how vegetation influences the soil types. So, as you can see here, two different conditions are given. In the first condition, you are seeing that grassland vegetation, and here you are seeing forest vegetation. So, in case of grassland vegetation, you are seeing that there are different types of soil horizon, A1, A2, BT, CB, CK and all these form. However, in case of forest vegetation, the A horizon is very thin, followed by an alluvial horizon E. We will discuss this horizon later on, and also the BT horizon and C1 and C2 horizon. So, the soil characteristic differs as a result of different types of vegetations. And also here in the second picture you will see we have, I have given here two different example. One is hemlock, which is a coniferous plant, another is sugar maple, which is a deciduous plant. And obviously in case of sugar maple, its roots are very effective for uptaking the calcium ions from the soil, from the deeper layers of the soils. So, and also the leaves of the sugar maple are highly rich in calcium. So, when the leaves decomposes over the soil surface, there will be high amount of calcium at the soil surface. So, obviously there will be comparatively higher pH at the soil surface due to the decomposition of calcium rich leaves of sugar maple, and there will be obviously lower pH in the bottom layer of the soil due to efficient uptake of calcium. However, in case of hemlock, the hemlock leaves do not have calcium in them. So, when they decompose over the soil surface, the soil pH remains somewhat near 4. So, as you can see, it is very clear that depending on another practical implication for this difference in nutrient cycling is, in case of sugar maple, the soil weathering will be more prevalent as compared to the hemlock. So, you can see the depending on differences in vegetation, obviously the type of soil varies from one place to another place. Obviously, when there will be grassland vegetation, there will be high accumulation of organic matter as compared to forest vegetation, and depending on the root uptake and depending on the nature of cations uptake and nature and chemical composition of the leaves, the adjacent soil characteristics also varies. So, this basically shows the impact of climate, organisms. Another important factor is organism, in case of organism is animals, and obviously when the animals, there are several macrofauna which are which are present into the soil, and when they move from one place to another place, they also churn the soil materials within the they are also churning, they helps in churning the soil materials, and this churning of the soil materials as a result of these organism is called pedoturbation, and as a result of pedoturbation the physical and chemical weathering increases. So, obviously the organism plays an important role for increasing the rate of soil formation. Topography, as we have already discussed, topography is basically the configuration of the land surface in terms of elevation, slope and landscape positions, and depending on the topography, the characteristics of the soil varies from one place to another place. As you can see, the number of horizon develops differing from one soil to another soil based on their local topography. And remember the couple of points that depressed areas experience higher rate of weathering and south facing slopes tends to be warmer, hence more weathering, and low lying and arid areas always show high salt buildup. So, finally, what is parent material? Now, parent material is the material from which soil develops. So, soil greatly resemble their parent material. For example, sandy soils often develop from granite and sandstone, and the mineralogical composition of parent material influences the physical and chemical weathering, which is quite obvious. So, depending on the types of parent materials also, we have differentiate different types of soil, and let us wrap up here, and from the next lecture we will start from here. Thank you.